Everyone. Thank you for your patience and thank you for coming tonight. Welcome to our Countywide Community Wildfire Protection Plan workshop for the Antelope Valley Forecast Zone. My name is Cameron Robertson and I'm a planner with the Los Angeles County Department of Regional Planning, and I'll be presenting the first portion of tonight's presentation. For tonight's community workshop, we'll have a detailed discussion about the Countywide Community Wildfire Protection Plan and introduce some of the interactive tools that we are rolling out with the plan. Next slide, please. So for tonight's presentation, we are going to provide a quick introduction of the project and team. We will go through an overview of the Community Wildfire Protection Plan and what the Countywide Community Wildfire Protection Plan is intended to cover. We'll discuss the Antelope Valley Forecast Zone and fire environment and some of the findings of the wildfire risk assessment. Next, we'll have a breakout discussion to go over the online wildfire prevention mapper. And we'll round out the meeting with information on next steps. So there will be opportunities at the end of the presentation for Q&A. If you do have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to place them in the chat box, and we will get to those questions after the presentation. Additionally, there will be a quick exit poll at the end of the presentation, so please do stick around. Next slide, please. And one more, please. Okay, so the project team includes LA County Planning, which includes myself, Cameron Robertson, as well as Tui Hua and Iris Chi, who are also on the call. Partnering on the project is the LA County Fire Department. With us tonight are Chief Ron Durbin and Chief Trevor Moore. And the consultant on the project is DUDEC. And from DUDEC tonight, we have Daniel Link Herrera and Scott Eckhart, who will also be presenting on the project today. Next slide, please. And one more, there we go. So before we jump into the details of the Integrated Wildfire Safety Program, we just wanted to say a few words about what the project is and why we are doing it. So the project has really been informed by the recent major fires that have occurred within the county over the last handful of years, including the Woolsey and Bobcat fires. So as you all know, drought, heat, and wildfire risks continue to increase, requiring more proactive planning from communities and governments alike. There are currently a number of emergency response projects and plans that the county administers that address wildfire emergencies during and after they've occurred through post-disaster recovery efforts. But this project that we're discussing tonight is intended to focus on planning and project stages that anticipate wildfires and their impacts and to protect communities against wildfire. So this project looks at wildfire mitigation projects and priorities at the program level. So while particular projects and hazard areas may be identified in the WRA or CCWPP, which we'll discuss later, the implementation of such plans and projects will still need to go through proper review procedures on a project-by-project basis. So with that being said, let's get into the details of the project here. So the Integrated Wildfire Safety Program was created as an umbrella to connect the various plan and policy programs that address wildfire prevention and protection. The general plan safety plan update is an element of the general plan for the entire unincorporated area. The general plan sets the vision for development and conservation of the unincorporated areas of the county. And the safety element provides for goals and policies for how we address natural, climate-induced, and man-made hazards. The Countywide Wildfire Risk Assessment, or the WRA, is a risk assessment that we are developing, which uses modeling tools that account for wildfire factors such as weather, topography, and vegetation, which collectively factor into the overall wildfire risk environment. So this document will map the various risk levels and how they relate to high-value resource areas, such as communities and infrastructure. The Unified Land Management Plan, or ULMP, is intended to be a strategic document that outlines the tools that the county is able to employ to manage the vegetation and wildfire hazards in the unincorporated county. ULMP also takes into consideration the complementary goals for habitat resource protections. And lastly, the Countywide Community Wildfire Protection Plan, or the CCWPP, is intended as a community-based document that provides specific community-level strategies that enable residents and local organizations to help protect their communities from wildfire. So we will go into more detail about the CCWPP in just a moment. Overall, the goals of the Integrated Wildfire Safety Plan are to first assess wildfire risk in the county. The plan does look at risk areas on a countywide level, and while the plan covers the full unincorporated area, the WRA also acknowledges that there are adjacency issues that require coordination with other jurisdictions. The second goal is to balance fuels reductions with ecosystem needs. While there are fuels that contribute to wildfire, they need to be addressed with consideration to protections for the ecosystem as a whole. And finally, we want to provide community-focused wildfire protection involving community members who live within as well as adjacent to fire risk areas, and enable broad participation for residents to protect their communities against fire. So now I'm going to hand it over to Scott Eckhart to discuss the Community Wildfire Protection Plan.
Thank you, Cameron. Appreciate the introduction. Next slide, thank you. So maybe just a high-level overview of what a Community Wildfire Protection Plan is. For those that aren't familiar, these documents were identified initially in the 2003 Healthy Forest Restoration Act, and they're intended to be a collaborative plan for communities that are at risk of wildfire impacts. They identify and prioritize areas for vegetation management or fuels reduction. They recommend measures for reducing structural ignitability. And as Cameron mentioned, this document we're discussing this evening is the Countywide CWPP. And so that document is different from a traditional community wildfire protection plan that can be prepared at even a neighborhood or a smaller community level. The document for the county, the main difference is the scale of the document, and the preparation of that countywide CWPP is being conducted at the countywide scale and including the unincorporated areas of the county. Next slide. So the purpose of the plan is to enhance community wildfire preparedness and protection by identifying fire hazard risk reduction strategies that balance sustainable ecological management and financial resources. Next slide. It's also important to relay what Community Wildfire Protection Plan is not. As the call-out box on the slide here notes, a CWPP is an educational tool that makes recommendations, but it does not commit agencies or the public to a course of action. It's not another set of regulations. It's not a vegetation management plan or an environmental assessment document. Next slide. Next, please. So specific to the countywide CWPP, as I mentioned, this plan covers the unincorporated portions of Los Angeles County. Those are the areas in green on the map there on the slide. This land area covers over 1.6 million acres and 54% of the county. Next. So during preparation of the plan, one of the things the plan does is evaluate the fire environment in the county. Some specific unique characteristics to the Los Angeles County fire environment are its Mediterranean climate, with notable Santa Ana wind conditions that occur each year in the fall and early winter months. The vegetation types across the county are pretty varied, with common types including chaparral, grassland, and woodland communities. There's some significant topographic features that affect vegetation type and wind and weather patterns across the county. Some examples of those include the San Gabriel Mountains, the Sierra Pelona Mountains, and the Santa Monica Mountains. And then there's three primary fire types or main fire types that occur in the county. Those would be wind-driven fires, for example, those occurring during Santa Ana wind conditions. Diurnal fires, which are those that occur during more typical normal or average weather conditions. And then fuel-driven fires, which are those that are primarily influenced by vegetation as well as topography or terrain. Next slide. So for the countywide CWPP, the county was broken up into five, what we're calling forecast zones. And these are geographic areas that are distinct from each other in respect to fire weather, vegetation, and terrain. So this evening we're discussing the Antelope Valley forecast zone, which is shown in the blue polygon there on the map, the northern part of the county. The other four forecast zones include the High Country, the Los Angeles Basin, the Santa Clarita Valley, and the Santa Monica Mountains. Next slide. So in general, the countywide CWPP would include an introduction, a description of the plan area broadly, a discussion of the planning and regulatory environment, and then more detailed discussions of each forecast zone, which would include discussion of the fire environment, which would include a discussion of fire history, terrain, vegetation type, etc. The results of the wildfire risk assessment for that particular forecast zone, and then identified actions and priorities that are specific to that area as well. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So specific to the Antelope Valley forecast zone, I'm going to actually start at the bottom bullet here. The entire forecast zone encompasses a little over 604,000 acres. 480,000 acres of that, or 79%, is unincorporated land. Of that 480,000, 72,000 acres are mapped at the state level as high and very high fire hazard severity zone. I just want to, can you hear me okay, Cameron? Thank you. Again, there was a pop-up in the chat that said I was fading, so just want to confirm. The Antelope Valley forecast zone is also characterized by lower building density and more sparse vegetation. Next slide, please. So in respect to the fire environment in the Antelope Valley forecast zone, the climate is influenced by the more high desert environment that's present in this zone. It does not experience true Santa Ana winds. However, it is influenced by seasonal dry, strong winds, but not the effect is not as great as other portions of the county. The forecast zone is largely flat, with the exception of the southern and southwestern border, where it abuts the high country. Vegetation is dominated by desert scrub, grassland, and chaparral. This forecast zone has experienced over 190 fires that have collectively burned over 160,000 acres in the past 51 years. And fires do burn into this zone from the adjacent high country forecast zone. This forecast zone does experience wind-driven, diurnal, and fuel-driven fires. Next slide. So as Cameron mentioned earlier, one of the components of the program was the wildfire risk assessment. And so I'll cover just briefly a discussion of that assessment and some summary results for the Antelope Valley Forecast Zone. This risk assessment was conducted using the Interagency Fuel Treatment Decision Support System software and tools. And the initial step in that assessment was to model and map integrated hazard. And so integrated hazard is a combination of wildfire likelihood and wildfire intensity, where wildfire likelihood is represented by burn probability and wildfire intensity is represented by flame length. Next slide. So here we have the model results for a Santa Ana wind condition fire in the Antelope Valley Forecast Zone. As you can see, the integrated hazard results here on the map. We have lowest hazard in blue on the scale up to highest hazard in red. And we see the results of that assessment and that analysis show that the higher and highest integrated hazard rankings occur along the southwest border of the forecast zone. We also see from the chart that the highest hazard conditions were present during the Santa Ana wind condition that we modeled. Next slide. The next step in the risk assessment is to conduct a quantitative wildfire risk assessment. And this is essentially combining the integrated hazard results with the location of highly valued resources and assets. And for this analysis, we looked at communities at risk and natural resources at risk. Next slide. So here we're seeing the model results for the evaluation of risk to communities in the Antelope Valley forecast zone. The areas in red are where we have communities located in areas that had experienced moderate, high, and higher integrated hazard rankings. So these are this mapping effort is important in identifying potential locations for potential wildfire risk reduction projects. Next slide, please. So just a summary of the two analyses we just saw on the maps and the previous slides. For the integrated hazard analysis, the higher and highest hazard areas were concentrated along the forecast zone's west and southwest border up against the high country. And the wind-driven fire scenario represented the highest hazard condition. For the quantitative risk assessment, communities at the highest risk were those in the wild and urban interface areas along that same west-southwest border. Again, wind-driven fire presented the highest risk to communities, and risk to natural resources were also highest along the same west-southwest border. Next slide. So here we're jumping a little bit to a brief discussion and summarized on a few slides of the results of the public survey that some community members in Antelope Valley Forecast Zone responded to. We're not going to cover all the questions, but I believe we have 3 slides summarizing some of the results. This slide is showing that when asked what actions community members are taking to protecting their home and their property from wildfire, over 80% of the respondents maintain defensible space, at least in some capacity, and a little over half of the respondents either lacked home hardening or defensible space in terms of the practices that they take on their property. Next slide. On this slide, we're looking at the 3 most popular actions that community members take for reducing fire risk on their properties. And the top 3 include clearing flammable and dry vegetation around built structures, maintaining roots and gutters free from leaves and other debris, and maintaining vegetation clearance from structures and chimneys. Next slide. And then finally, one of the survey questions sought to understand what are some of the barriers to maintaining one's property in a fire-safe condition or implementing fire risk reduction measures. And almost half of the respondents that responded to this question noted that conditions on neighboring properties were a barrier to their making their property safe. The second largest barrier was money. 38% of respondents noted this as a barrier for making their property fire safe. And none of the respondents believed that their home was currently safe. I'll hand it back to you, Cameron. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Appreciate it, Scott. So now we'll open it up if there are any clarifying questions. If you have a question, you can raise your hand. We'll call on you. Or you can put your question into the chat. As of now, Jacqueline Eyre has one question. How does the ULMP relate to the land use element of the general plan? So that's a good question. This project is responsive to the safety element, but it doesn't make any changes or updates to the land use element. Land management, as it's being referred to in the Unified Land Management Plan, is referring to kind of a comprehensive set of methods for managing vegetation, for managing essentially fire hazards that are vegetative and non-vegetative. So land management is a better catch-all term than vegetation management. And this project doesn't propose any zoning or land use changes, so it will not have any impact on the land use element in the general plan. Are there any other questions at this time? Doesn't look like it. Okay, if we can move on at this time, there will be another Q&A opportunity after the presentation. So if you do have any questions, again, feel free to let us know. So right now we're going to move into the breakout discussion. Jacqueline just responded real quick. So you do not expect the ULMP to ever conflict with the land use element. We don't. There may be projects in the future that require some sort of zoning or land use update, but this project will not be proposing any zone changes or land use updates. I hope so the breakout discussion, we're about to go into some breakout groups. So in these groups, your facilitators will be presenting the Wildfire Prevention Mapper tool. So they're going to go over the functions and navigation of the tool, and how to identify locations in your community that present wildfire hazards. So in the workshop, you'll learn how to map the type of hazard, the size and specific details of the hazard, and where you can upload photos to help ground truth these potential hazards in your community. There may be some additional questions for discussion, and then at the end, we will also have one person from the group provide a quick 30-second report out on a topic that came up during the discussion. So good luck. We'll see you back here in about 20 minutes.
Everybody, welcome. My name is Tui Hua, and I'm with the Department of Regional Planning. I will be your facilitator in this room for our discussion. Just to reiterate the instructions that Cameron had provided, we're going to go through a mapping exercise, and I have additional questions if we are able to get through that exercise first. So bear with me for a second as I switch over to the macro tool screen. Okay. Before I jump into the macro tool exercise, are there any questions, clarifying questions that I could answer before we get into that? All right, seeing none. In addition to the discussion or me being the facilitator, I do have Chief Durbin from the fire department with me here. And also Dana as well from DUDEC, who will be supporting. So this is an open dialogue. Feel free to turn on your cameras if you're comfortable doing so, if you're not obligated otherwise. And feel free to unmute at any time to jump into the discussion. Again, this is open, and very excited to hear what you have to share specifically about the Antelope Valley. So today our focus is on the Antelope Valley forecast zone. As Scott had mentioned, it's this northern region of the Antelope Valley. The southern border of it runs approximately along Pear Blossom, Juniper Hills on the southern portion here, runs up diagonally about the San Andreas Fault, and captures just kind of bisects the Pelona mountains, and continues to move northward. So a lot of the fire hazard area is in the high country forecast zone in terms of the larger area, but there is a portion here in the Antelope Valley forecast zone as well too. So with this tool, I just want to share with you the functions of it. We will provide the link to this tool so you can access it and provide us with additional data points on your own time so that you have additional time to make those observations and record them to us. So with this link, the idea is that based upon your observations, whether they be about vegetation or even non-vegetative fields, locations in your community that you think could be problem areas that could spark fires. You may have driven around and seen a large haul of non-vegetative debris that's been sitting there for 6 months or a year, and as it's become hotter and hotter, that may dry, that may spread, and it may be of concern. We'd want to hear about that. So we have options on the map here to indicate the type of hazard that you're observing. It may be brush or grass, trees, non-vegetative, so things like items that people have thrown away from their home and are collecting and could be flammable. And then other, we may have not captured an option that you are observing. And so there are two ways to record the information on the map. You're able to zoom in very specifically. So as you can see, we get into very high, both high level and then very narrow, refined locations on the map. So let's say you're driving along Pear Blossom Highway and you notice that at Pear Blossom Highway and 106th Street East, there's a pile of something on this southwest corner. So we would ask that you identify what that potential hazard is. And you can either just place a dot on the map, or you can try to indicate to us how large of an area that is by using this polygon tool. So I'm just going to use an example here with the let's say it's overgrown brush, and it looks of concern. You would select that and you would place it on the map here. And then a subsequent window opens that allows you to adjust that point. If it's not actually brush, you notice that it's actually grass instead. And then we're asking for additional identifying information. So when we go out to this location, we want to know what it is that you observe so that we can take a look at it too. So additional identifying information helps us to do so. So for example, the distance from this intersection, or if you can identify whether it spans about 20 feet along the road or if it's an isolated pile. Any sort of specific descriptors is very helpful to us. And if you happen to take a photo of it, you're able to also attach it as a file attachment. So when we go out there, we're reviewing it against that photo and the information that you've provided to us. In the event that you place that dot and you need to make an edit, you need to move it a little further along, you can just click on this edit geometry, and then you're able to move the dot. And then once you've completed the fields, you go ahead and save it, and it'll save that data point for us, and then we will come back and review that. All right. Let's bring this back here. Having said that, and with those instructions provided, I know that it may not be top of mind with the specific locations, but are there any locations that the room participants would like to share at this point? Certainly think about that for a moment. And I'm happy to come back to this exercise as well too. So just as a reminder, you will be able to have access to this on your own time to come back to it as you think about it or make your observations. And during the next 15 minutes as well too, if any locations come to mind, just unmute yourself and let me know, and we can place a location on the map. Otherwise, I do have a couple of additional questions to go through with the group. Let me share the screen here. I do have some additional questions. Yes, and also from Chief Durbin in terms of the identification of potential fuel sources or areas of concern if you are observing large mulch piles as well too. We have observed those in the Antelope Valley, and those do catch fire. I have a couple of additional questions that I'd love to pose to the group here to get your feedback. The first one is related to education. Firefighting is not a solo project. It's not a solo effort just by the fire department team. This really is a collective effort between the local emergency responders, the planning team, but also residents. You're really our eyes and ears on the streets and in the communities on a daily basis. Edgar has a question about should large homeless encampments be mapped as potential fire risks? It could be listed as other, and we'll certainly take that into consideration because of fires being sparked. In more recent years, a lot of fires are typically sparked, and they're human induced or human caused, and not natural factors. So feel free to enter in that data point, and we'll assess it. Going back to my question about education, it is a collective effort, and education is hugely important. Everybody can take part in wildfire prevention, and that's really important to do as well too before wildfires happen. We want to make sure that everybody is receiving the information that they need to be able to participate. So thinking back in your community, in your experience, are you receiving the information needed? And if not, how best can we improve that? What are the channels of communication that is preferred for us to be able to get information to you? And how about your neighbors? Are there barriers to you receiving that information?
Well, I can.
A little bit. I think some of what we're asking about is whether or not you're receiving home hardening information, defensible space information, planning information as well, land use planning, land use management planning, anything that relates to that. I think that the homeless encampment is a component of it, and absolutely it's something that we would like to know about because it could relate to other areas that have potential hazards on them that we can manage. And so we would map the two together and see if there's a relationship, and then see if there's a risk associated with the encampment related to wildfire.
Thank you, Chief. All right, this is the time when I start calling on names because I'm so interested in hearing what you have to say. John, just because your camera's on, if you don't mind unmuting and sharing a little bit about maybe how you receive information, and if you've received, as the Chief has mentioned, if you've received information about home hardening, defensible space, and how we can improve that.
Sure.
John, you're muted.
Oh, that's thank you. Yes, that would help. How's that?
Perfect.
At our two community publications, the Acton Agua Dulce News and the Lake Los Angeles News, every week almost, we receive pictures of mattresses and junk dumped in the desert. So that's how we get it, and we publicize it and try to get people to volunteer when we take trucks out to the sites to pick all the junk up. But it's ongoing. And there are people in each community that are very anxious and work hard to clean the terrain up. Another way we receive is the fire department comes by and puts a hanger on our doorknob that says these weeds need to be trimmed, or these weeds need to be hauled away, or this junk needs to be cleaned up. And those really are the two ways that we receive information at our publications and at our homes.
And being with the local newspaper, John, have you received feedback from local community members that their preferred method of receiving information is either by reading the newspaper and by receiving those door hangers?
No, we never have received a preference. However, being in the news dissemination business for a long time, what gets to people is always print, newspapers. We're online, so most people look at their cell phone and see an article about fire cleanup or a fire that happened, and they look at that online. But talking to one another too about the fire hazards or the fires that have happened in the past, like the Bobcat fire, and then before that there was one, or actually two here in Acton, Agua Dulce that were quite dangerous, and so community discussion conveys a lot of information about how the fire department reacted and how the fire was discovered and how it was started. Those are the ways that people learn about the fires here. Now, as far as preferring a way to receive the information, I would have to say they don't prefer any particular single way. It's a multi-task, multi-effort enterprise to inform the public today about anything.
Yeah, I agree. Trying to cover all of our bases to cast the net wide to a variety of audiences is definitely key. Diana, would you like to share any thoughts on the topic of education about wildfire risk in the community? And you are on mute if you're talking. No worries. We do have just about 4 minutes left in our room. I do have an additional, go ahead, Edgar.
Hey, I just wanted to say, can you hear me good?
Yes.
Perfect. One of the ways that we're disseminating information is my insurance agency actually runs a public outreach where we go to town councils and talk about creating defensible space. The best way that I've found people who are receptive to that information seems to be in person and with the infographics that we've been able to bring to those events and pamphlets as such. I am hoping to have more community outreach events where I think in person can actually get people proactive in creating defensible spaces around their homes and mitigating their fire risk.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Edgar. So some visuals, it sounds like, as well, too, to engage the audience.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Is there a preference on social media websites, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram? Just curious if any of you four have a preference.
Facebook has seemed to be a pretty good source of information that I found for these communities. You get a lot of neighbors going on and asking information about what's going on with the fires and how to reduce the risk. Nextdoor is also a good one. Not so much the other social media outlets, is what I've seen.
Great. Thank you. And we'll round out our conversation around barriers. So in the presentation, Scott had mentioned, had gone through the survey results, some of the survey results around barriers to fire safety. So I'd like to dive a little bit into that discussion about what you see as barriers to improving fire safety in your community.
I got a little thing to chime in. One of the biggest things that I've found in some of the communities I've visited is the monetary aspect. It can get real expensive to start removing, certain debris or dead trees in the households. And while LA County has a higher poverty, a pretty high median income level, some of these communities have some really low income households where they can't afford it.
In your observations, is it primarily related to the kind of the one-time retrofits, or is it the annual maintenance that's necessary that is a barrier?
It seems like it's both. A lot of folks are just kind of living paycheck to paycheck, so it's hard for them to keep up on anything.
Got it. All right. On either of the questions posed about education or barriers to improving fire safety in communities. Any thoughts, Jairo, on those subjects?
In terms of barriers, something that's been discussed on our end is the ability of control burnings, and that kind of helping with the fires. There are for example, Native American control burnings. There's a traditional practice that could kind of start placing some barriers, but perhaps not the ones that we're looking for here.
if you don't mind expanding on that just a little bit in terms of the burnings and them being, are you saying restriction of burnings or the prescribed burnings being the problem themselves?
Prescribed burnings as a way of managing the fires. That's it's been a Native American practice and something in California, and there's a discussion with tribes about bringing this practice back, and so working with agencies and working with firefighters about how can we tribes continue to practice this tradition.
There's a few minutes. Okay, so I think we're all back now. So I hope that workshop was helpful for everyone. I'm now going to call on each of the groups to briefly report out what they discussed. I'll call on Iris first.
Hi, everyone. So I will be reporting for our group. So we had Jackie and Robert, Jackie from Acton and Robert from, I guess, north of the ridge where the lakes are located. And, our participants mentioned how single point of access is a big evacuation barrier that they've noticed in their community. So, we've talked about how they can provide that type of information in the wildfire prevention mapper, along with any vegetative hazards that they see in the community.
Great, thank you, Iris. And Twee, how about your group?
Yeah, I'll report out for my group. We talked more about the education component and what would be effective in communities. And essentially it's trying to reach audiences through all communication avenues, just to diversify and be able to touch upon everybody's preferences in terms of social media. Facebook might be a more effective tool than some of the other social media outlets. And then what community members have observed locally is reading the newspaper, but also receiving the door hangers from the fire department on an annual basis. And then also acknowledging that prescribed burns was had been in the past a Native American tradition, and wanting to bring that back in partnership with the fire agency. Thanks, Karen.
Great, thank you, Twee. So now we're going to move on to next steps in the project. So the chart on the screen now gives us an idea as of where we are in the IWSP process. The WRA, Wildfire Risk Assessment, and ULMP technical documents are continuing to be drafted and reviewed by our technical advisory committee at this time, which is made up of members from partnering land and fire management agencies. So they're still in the process. And as you can see, we're at the community outreach stage of the project. We'll be conducting workshops and outreach through August for this round of community forecast zone workshops. We'll also be soliciting information from community members and stakeholders moving forward. So we will be incorporating public input into the IWSP documents, and your participation will help make the final CWPP as thorough and broadly representative as possible. So next slide, please. So how can you help? As you leave the meeting today, please think about the wildfire hazards in your community and where you might report issues in the wildfire prevention mapper. We will release the wildfire prevention mapper to the public shortly, so you will receive an email with that link once it's made available. If you have any questions or would like to review the information presented this evening, you can please visit our website at the link on the screen, planning.lacounty.gov/site/climate/CCWPP. And also, if you have any questions or comments, please reach out to us at the email link safety@planning.lacounty.gov. So if we go to the next slide, so we're going to open it up for questions right now. It looks like, Jackie, you had one question. Let me pull it up. Okay, so is today's meeting just about input on the CCWPP, or is it also for input on the ULMP? So today's meeting was to give everyone kind of a general idea about the project that includes both the WRA, ULMP, and the CCWPP. The input that we're looking for, at least as we kind of described tonight, was input on the fire prevention mapper, which you can do essentially once it becomes publicly available. You can put information into it as soon as possible. The CCWPP and the ULMP will be released at some point in the near future for public comment. So you will be updated on when that public comment period will open.
And if I may,
that help, Jackie?
Cameron,
Yep.
yeah, just to add to that as well too. Yes, so the CCWPP is typically a grassroots community-driven document, and so it requires the participation of community members on the CWPP very heavily. It's a voluntary document. It's not required. And the reason why we're doing it is that there are a number of communities that don't have organized representation, that are in very high fire hazard severity zones. And so it gives them opportunity to be able to organize a fire safe council if they don't have one, but also be able to receive that support to develop a strategy document and project opportunities to receive grant funding to move forward. As Cameron mentioned, when we release the CWPP, the whole package of everything will be shared with the public. That includes the ULMP as well as the WRA. But as mentioned in Cameron's description at the top of the meeting, both the WRA and the ULMP are technical documents. And with the modeling, we're happy to take in feedback and observations, but it is a very technical document. Similarly with the ULMP, so it's not a traditional land use document. It's not a planning document, and we're happy to share it and have further discussions on it. Thanks, Cameron.
Appreciate the clarification, Tweed. So if there are no more questions, we are going to open up an exit poll for tonight's workshop. So it's just a few questions on meeting content. So before you all go, please let us know what you thought about it. Thank you again for being here. We really appreciate your time and attention tonight. And please contact us if you have any questions in the future. Thank you, Chiefs, for being here. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Good night.
Have a good night.
Thank you.